Let me tell you how it all started. When I got married, I never thought that one day I would be in an open relationship. I always believed that couples were only meant for each other, but my husband had other desires. He had always been very open about his wants, and after a while, he made a confession that surprised me. He liked the idea of seeing me with other men. At first, this seemed strange to me. How could this be? How could he be happy with this? It was a completely new idea for me, something I had never imagined before. But because I loved him and always wanted to see him happy, I decided to try. This was something I did for him, to please him and keep our relationship alive. The first few times, my heart was pounding with excitement. I was full of nerves and even fear. The idea of being with someone else, especially while my husband watched, felt like my reality was far away. I had a hard time understanding how he was enjoying it. But he was always there, supportive, encouraging, and most importantly, happy. Over time, I started to feel more comfortable and began to understand what he was feeling better. What I had previously done just to please him began to awaken a curiosity in me. I began to ask myself, what if I liked it too? The initial fear gave way to a feeling of freedom, and suddenly, I found myself in situations I never imagined. I was experiencing things that I never thought would be part of my life. It was the first door that opened to a world. A world where the forbidden had a different taste, a world where adrenaline and desire walked side by side. And to be honest, maybe this was the point where I realized that I was beginning to love this life. What started for him slowly became a part of me as well. Over time, something inside me began to change. As I said, I was doing this to please my husband, but over time, I started feeling something different. You know that feeling of adrenaline when you do something that no one should know about? That was exactly what began to take hold of me. I felt a mix of nerves and excitement, even thinking about what I was going to do made my skin prickle. Someone like me, who was always so controlled and predictable, seemed to be giving birth to a new version of myself, one who wanted to experience more. A version that loved danger and the unexpected. And what surprised me the most was how much doing something secret, something forbidden, affected me. I began to realize that desire wasn't just about the act itself but about the entire context. The tension in the air, the shared glances, the anticipation of what might happen. All of these things were part of the pleasure. That's when I realized I wasn't doing this just for my husband. I loved this life, this freedom that made me feel alive. The idea of being with someone else, the idea of breaking the rules I had followed for years, became addictive. Every time I got involved in something forbidden, my heart beat faster, my skin tingled, it was like my whole body was alert, ready for anything. The feeling of crossing boundaries, of living something that most people couldn't even imagine, was dizzying, and it gave me a kind of power that I hadn't realized I had. I felt powerful, as if I was the one controlling the situation. And this gave me the urge to want more. The desire to try new things, to escape from the ordinary, grew inside me every day. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, I knew there were risks to this life, but at the same time, it was impossible to resist that feeling of freedom. I no longer wanted to live according to expectations of how a relationship should be. I wanted more, I wanted to feel more. I wanted to experience everything I once thought was impossible. And so, slowly, my desire for the forbidden became a part of me. Every new experience, every situation outside of the norm, fueled my desire to keep going. And the more risks I took, the more alive I felt. But this was just the beginning. The real adventure was yet to come. The story started when we moved to a new complex because of my husband's job. I wasn't someone who paid much attention to the neighbors, but it was impossible not to notice our neighbor, John. He lived right across from us, and he was the kind of man who caught everyone's attention. Tall, strong, fair-skinned, and with a confident demeanor. At first, I was just watching. I saw him walking around the complex, and I found myself asking, what was so interesting about him? But as you know, these kinds of thoughts start small, and after a while, you find yourself imagining much more. He and my husband met at a complex meeting, and this brought them even closer. The fact that the man I had fantasized about for so long was now part of our circle made my heart beat faster. It felt like the game was beginning, but I didn't know what the rules were yet. Of course, the tension quickly escalated. John often came over to our house, and I noticed that he looked at me in a different way. It wasn't just politeness or courtesy, there was more to it. The way he kept his eyes on me for longer than necessary, the way he followed me with his gaze as I walked through the living room. There was something different there. One day, we were at home, watching a match with my husband and John. Both of them were focused on the television while I was serving snacks. But every time I passed by, I felt John's gaze burning on my skin. He tried to hide it, but it was impossible not to notice, and I liked it. I enjoyed feeling that unhidden tension, that desire. On the other hand, my husband acted as if he didn't notice anything. He was watching the match, but I knew he was aware of everything going on. He had always been good at creating situations like this, letting events flow naturally. And of course, I knew something different would happen that day. I was ready, this was the opportunity one had been waiting for. Then, during the break in the match, my husband broke the silence in the living room with his usual calmness and, looking at John, asked without hesitation, "What do you think of my wife, John?" My heart sped up, I knew something new was beginning, something that went beyond fantasies. John was, of course, surprised, but I had already taken control. There was no turning back from that moment, the game had started. My husband had created the perfect opportunity, as always, and now it was up to me and John to decide what would happen next. The atmosphere was tense, and there was a kind of tension in the air that I had never felt before. John was surprised by my husband's question, but a few seconds later, he smiled and said, "She's amazing." Those words were like pouring gasoline on fire. From that moment on, everything changed. I sat down between the two of them, feeling the warmth of their gazes on me. My husband was calm, watching everything, as if he already knew what was going to happen. And I knew he wanted to see where this would go. But what he didn't expect was that I wanted this just as much as he did. John seemed a bit more hesitant, but curiosity and desire were written all over his face. That's when I decided to take charge of the situation. I turned to John, and with a provocative smile, I said, "How will you know unless you try?" The look of surprise on his face was almost funny, but I didn't let the moment cool down. I knew he was interested too, and I didn't want to wait any longer. You know that feeling when time seems to stand still? That's exactly how I felt. Everything around us seemed to disappear. It was just me, him, and that delicious tension. Without saying anything more, I moved closer to him. My husband, sitting beside me, just watched silently, letting things happen. When our lips finally touched, I felt an explosion inside me. John's kiss was intense, filled with suppressed desire, and I found myself completely drawn in. With every passing second, I was diving deeper into something irreversible. His touch, the way his hands held my face tightly, the intensity of his kisses. Everything was so different from anything I had experienced before. I knew I was doing something risky, something forbidden, but the adrenaline of being there, finally fulfilling that secret desire, was addictive. This was my first time with John, and I couldn't help but think about how different everything felt. The intensity, the passion, the feeling of doing something forbidden. Everything made my heart race, and I wanted more. And of course, my husband was watching everything, not missing a single detail, completely engrossed in the situation. But this was just the beginning. After that first time, things began to develop in ways I could never have imagined. With every meeting, the adrenaline and desire grew even more. I found myself even more caught up in a life I once thought could never be mine. After that first encounter, everything between us changed completely. What used to be an isolated fantasy was now a part of our routine. My husband was, as always, fully involved in the situation, and John, after getting over his initial shyness, started to feel more comfortable. That's when I realized that this wasn't just a simple physical relationship, it was creating a new dynamic. A real love triangle. It was strange and exciting at the same time. I found myself torn between two men, but unlike what many might think, I felt no confusion. This was a situation that worked for us. My husband had always enjoyed seeing this side of me, and now he seemed happier than ever. John, on the other hand, was giving himself more and more with each meeting. It was like we all had found the same harmony. Everyone was playing their role perfectly. But what connected me to this new reality wasn't just the physical side. The freedom I felt gave me a sense of power and control. I was at the center of this relationship, and it made me feel more alive than ever. Knowing that two men desired me allowed me to see a version of myself that I didn't know existed. The most interesting thing was how naturally my husband took the whole situation. He had always enjoyed watching, being there, but now, with John fully involved, he seemed even more entertained. Our relationship became a constant game of seduction and desire. Everyone knew what they were doing. There were no secrets or lies. With every meeting, things got more intense. I no longer felt bound to only attract the interest of one man. The idea of being with just one man felt limiting to me. This freedom, the feeling of crossing the boundaries I had set for myself in the past, was completely irresistible. Over time, John became a permanent part of our lives. He was no longer just my husband's friend or a temporary relationship, he was part of this new life we had built together. The most interesting thing was how natural, how fluid everything happened. It was as if everything was happening exactly as it should. What started as just a game, a fantasy, had now turned into something much bigger. It was a new way of living, a dynamic I could never have imagined before, and the most incredible thing was that we were all comfortable with it. Everyone found their own pleasure in this, and that's what kept us connected. But this bond was about to get even more complicated. As time went on, the different experiences I had with John and my husband started to turn into something bigger inside me. I wanted more. Being with just two men wasn't enough, I had a desire to explore more. The urge to have new experiences grew, and the idea of being with more men at the same time appeared in my mind in an irresistible way. I remember very clearly the moment this thought first formed. It was one of those nights. Me, John, and my husband were together as usual. But that night, as desire grew between us, a different thought crossed my mind. It wasn't just a moment where I thought about how much John was attracted to me or the conspiratorial looks my husband gave while watching. I began to wonder what it would be like if there were more. And this thought excited me even more. It was a fantasy I had never explored before, but suddenly it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I had always loved pushing my limits, seeing how far I could go, and this new idea was exactly that. A challenge, an opportunity to take another risk. The more I thought about it, the stronger the desire grew. The idea of being with three men at the same time, of being the center of their desire, gave me a sense of freedom and excitement that I couldn't control. But at the same time, I knew it wouldn't be simple. I wondered how my husband would react, how John would feel about this new desire that had taken root in me. Would they accept it? I couldn't rush it, it had to be the right time. And then, during a casual conversation at home, I brought up the subject. We talked about fantasies, about what else we wanted to try. My husband, as always, was open to every idea, and John was already comfortable, curious to see how far I would go. So, almost as a joke, I said, "What if next time, there were three of us?" There was a few seconds of silence, followed by laughter, but I could see that the idea had already taken hold. John gave me a look that was both surprised and excited, and my husband looked at me with that knowing smile, as if he knew this would happen eventually. I had taken the first step. From that moment on, I couldn't get the idea of being with three men at the same time out of my mind. I knew it was a fantasy I could make real, and now, more than ever, I wanted to try it. I wanted to see where desire would take me and, most importantly, to see how far they were willing to go with me. The question now was, who would be next? Who would join us in this new adventure? I knew things were about to get even more intense, and I was eager to see where it would all lead. But this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Everything was going better than I had expected. My husband was pleased with our lifestyle, John was becoming more involved every day, and I felt free, experiencing things I never thought possible. However, Amidst all this freedom, something happened that caught me completely off guard and changed everything. I got pregnant. At first, the idea of having a child excited me. My husband and I had talked about it before, and he had always wanted to be a father. So, when I told him, I saw a mix of joy and excitement on his face. For him, it was news that symbolized the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, sealing our family. He was so happy, so sure that the baby was his, that it never even crossed my mind to tell him the truth. The problem was, deep down, I knew things weren't that simple. Since my first encounter with John, our lives had intertwined in ways I could never have imagined. And now, with this pregnancy, a doubt began to grow inside me: who was the real father of my child? Was it my husband, who had always been willing to take our relationship to the next level, or was it John, with whom I felt connected in a way that went beyond the physical? This doubt began to eat me alive. Every day, I looked at my husband, who was so happy, and felt guilty. But at the same time, I couldn't imagine what would happen to us if the truth came out. If the baby was John's, everything I had built with my husband would crumble: trust, love, security, it would all disappear. And then there was John. He had no idea. He was just a part of a life full of pleasures and adventures. But what if he found out? How would he react if he learned he might be the father? Would he want to be involved, or would he pull away? The truth was, I was completely lost. The thought of getting a DNA test crossed my mind every day, but the fear of what the results might reveal held me back. At the same time, I couldn't escape the doubt. When my husband talked about the future, about how excited he was to be a father, I felt a tightness in my chest. I knew I was living a lie, but I couldn't find the courage to face the truth. The fear of losing everything kept me tied to this situation, and so the secret of my child's paternity became my greatest burden. While my husband lived in his happiness, and John continued his carefree life, I was trapped between two worlds. I didn't know how I would escape this dead end. Would I ever have the courage to learn the truth? Would I be ready to face the consequences, or would I continue living this lie for everyone's sake? Time passed, and despite all the uncertainties I carried, I tried to continue my life. Every moment I spent with my husband and our child brought me joy, but at the same time, the doubt about paternity grew like a silent shadow. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, I couldn't ignore the fact that I was living a lie. And worst of all, I was dragging my husband and child into it. How much longer could I keep up this charade? My relationship with John hadn't changed, but every time I saw him, my heart raced, not with desire, as it once had, but with fear of him finding out the truth. Would he start to suspect at some point? What if one day he asked questions about the baby? I knew he didn't want to take on the responsibility of fatherhood, but what if he noticed similarities? The thought kept me up at night. On the other hand, my husband suspected nothing. He loved the child deeply. Watching him play with our son, the way he cared for him, made me feel even more guilty. Every time I saw them together, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. I wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that this situation could go on forever, but deep down, I knew it was an illusion. The pressure grew with each passing day. It wasn't just the fear of losing my husband's love and trust, but also a financial concern. I depended on the stability we had built together, and I knew that if the truth came out, that security would vanish. The possibility of divorce scared me. Not only would I lose my comfortable lifestyle, but how would I take care of my child alone? And above all, what would be the emotional impact on my son? He was innocent, and already deeply bonded with my husband. How would he react if he found out my husband might not be his real father? The thought of my husband's heartbreak, of watching our family fall apart because of a decision I had made in a moment of freedom and adventure, was devastating. Evenings at home were the hardest. When the house was silent and I had time to think, the doubts resurfaced. Could I keep this secret forever? Maybe, if John stayed away from the issue, everything could remain as it was. But what if, as our son grew, the physical similarities with John became more apparent? Would people notice? Would my husband notice? And then there was the fear of the truth coming out unexpectedly. What if one day our son needed a medical test that revealed something about his genetic makeup? Or what if, out of curiosity, he decided to trace his ancestry in the future? These scenarios seemed distant for now, but the possibilities were real and made me anxious. No matter how much I tried to hide the truth, it could come out at any moment. And then there was the matter of the DNA test. Every day, my desire to end this uncertainty grew stronger. I knew the test would give me a definitive answer, but the fear of the results kept me from moving forward. Taking the test would be like opening Pandora's box, with no way to go back. What if the result was exactly what I feared? How could I tell my husband that the child he loved so much wasn't his? The decision paralyzed me. I felt like I was at a crossroads, not knowing which way to go. On one hand, I could continue living this lie, pretending everything was fine, and convince myself that my son really belonged to my husband. On the other hand, I could accept the truth, take the test, and risk losing everything we had built. And the question that haunted me was it worth risking everything? The fear of what the truth could do to our lives held me back, but the doubt that kept growing inside me was eating me alive. No matter how much I tried to live in the moment, the past always came back to remind me that there was something unresolved. And I knew that sooner or later, it could explode in a way I couldn't control. For now, I decided to keep pretending that everything was fine. Life went on, and I would do everything I could to keep up appearances. Maybe, with time, I would find a solution, or gather the courage to face the truth. But until then, I would maintain this fragile balance and pray that my secret wouldn't come out and ruin everything. The end of this story is still uncertain. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing: truth always finds a way. And when that moment comes, no matter the outcome, I will have to face it. Until then, I will keep living under this shadow and try to enjoy every moment as much as I can. Because deep down, I know that the peace I feel now is only temporary. One day, will I have the courage to learn the truth? Only time will tell.